My videos are ad-free. So if you like these types of videos, like and subscribe. The church at the edge of town seemed empty, as it usually was, which was why she and I found ourselves in the back of the building, sitting at the top of its high concrete staircase. We needed to be alone as our lives fell apart. We needed to come apart away from everyone else. And as I sat there, 17 years old and full of heartache, it honestly felt like my entire world was crashing down around me. Even though we did our best to disappear into the early night hours, there was a bright light raining down on us from above the church's back door, like a spotlight on our pain. As we sat there, we did our best to ignore the exposure. Did you really sleep with him? I asked her again, for what might have been the 100th time. Waiting for her familiar answer, I continued to look out across the open field behind the church. The field was wide and long, much larger than a football field, perhaps even as large as a couple of them. It marked the outskirts of my little town, ending with a tree line in the distance. As I peered out over the empty field, it wasn't hard to imagine that she and I were the last two people remaining in the entire world. What a depressing idea. Yes, she finally answered after several seconds of silence. Even though I already knew the answer, having heard it 100 times before, I still held out a sliver of empty hope that a response would suddenly change. All she had to do was tell me no. One simple no would erase 100 yeses. And, sadly, I would happily believe her. I would erase those yeses from memory and never think of them again. Anything for us to go back to the way we were, before her cousin had unexpectedly called my phone, before knowing about him. But the answer, along with reality, would not change. A real yes would never become a fake no. At least not for me. What do we do now? I asked, my eyes feeling the threatening burn of oncoming tears. I both heard and felt her puff out a breath of frustrated air. I wanted to look over and see her face, see her expressions, know that she was feeling the same type of way that I was, but at the same time, I couldn't bear it. So I continued to keep my sights on the dark field and the calm emptiness of it, which was the opposite of my full chaotic brain. Suddenly, she sprang to her feet. Startled, I cringed away from her unexpected movements, as if jolted from sleep. I had to finally look at her. Her slender body and beautiful face. Her caramel-colored skin. My love. My loss. Deep inside I ached for her. An ache that resonated from my core. I did my best to bury that ache as I watched her move to the back door of the church. Turning back to me, she replied, "Let's ask God." As she placed her hand on the door's knob, my eyes darted to the church's gravel lot. I knew the building was unoccupied, but for some reason I still had to visually make sure that there were no cars. I could only see the back half of the lot, but it was obviously empty. Like I knew it would be. As it usually was. Compared to the other handful of churches that are found along that particular stretch of road, a road I often referred to as Saints Row, that church was an oddity. It was an oddity because, having lived in the same town my whole life, I have never personally known anyone who attended it. Yet, I knew that there had to be at least a few people who went to this church, because occasionally I would notice a handful of cars parked in the gravel lot. But unlike those who went to the other churches, which normally met on Sunday mornings and sometimes Wednesday evenings, outside of their special functions, there didn't appear to be any rhyme or reason for when the people of that particular church, whomever they may be, came together to worship. If this door is unlocked, she said, returning my attention to the cruel reality, it means that God wants us to come inside. There was no way that the door would be unlocked. No way. There were two tall windows, one on each side of the door, but they were stained glass, strange abstract and obscure shapes in multiple vibrant colors, making it impossible for me to properly see through them. The only thing that I could make out through the colors of the stained glass was a subtle light coming from a dim source somewhere inside the building. I couldn't tell if there was anyone inside moving around or moving past the windows, but I didn't believe so. From all appearances, it seemed like no one was home. That meant that the door should be locked. I mean, there was no way that the priest or pastor or whoever would leave the building without locking up behind them. Not in a town like ours. Yet, as I was getting ready to tell her this fact, she turned the knob. It turned. Without resistance or restraint. I tried to plead. I wanted to tell her to stop. No. Don't go in there. Before I could say anything out loud, she had the door pushed open before disappearing inside. Either by her hand or the force of physics, the door returned closed. My heart pounded in my ears as my pulse began to race. I was suddenly terrified. We should not be doing this. This is wrong. My mouth became so dry that my tongue started to hurt. We should not be doing this. But what if it was actually God's will, whether it be my God or whatever God those of that church worshipped? What if she had been right and the door being unlocked was, in all reality, a signal for us to come inside? A strange animal-like scream suddenly erupted behind me. Startled, my bones nearly jumped through my skin. Twisting around, my eyes fell on a broad concrete base, the gray slab illuminated by the light above the church door. Planted deeply into the grass and earth of the large field, the rock base sat several yards from the empty gravel lot. My eyes began on the base before swiftly running upward along the narrow stone pillar that the base held, tracking the source of the scream. At the top of the pillar, nearly 2 stories up, there was a statue of a man wearing a grey robe. That statue always creeped me out. Whenever I would happen to pass by that church, for whatever reason, it always felt as if the statue man was staring at me, his eyes following me, even though his face was completely concealed beneath an upturned hood. It always gave me the chills, as if his eyes were directly on me, following me. Did the statue man even have eyes? Did whoever made him feel the need to add them? Or was he faceless under that hood? The statue man, whether he was supposed to be a monk or a pilgrim or wise man of Jesus, had his left arm outstretched wide in the motion of a coming embrace. Yet, the embrace was only half formed, because the statue man did not have a right arm. When I had first noticed the missing arm, I had assumed withering and age had caused the piece of stone to merely fall off. Yet, looking closer, I wasn't so sure. The right arm was indeed missing. However, the grey robe had a right sleeve hanging limp at the statue man's side, an empty sleeve in which a right arm would fill. At that moment, it seemed to me that there never was a right arm. Strange. Another animal-like screech rang out. Perched on the statue man's only arm was a large dark feathered vulture. Like the statue man, the large corpse eater was also staring intensely down at me. After adjusting its footing on the arm, the vulture opened its mouth wide and gave another eerie scream, which sounded like the mixture of a crying woman and a shrill wind blowing. Trying to shake off the creepy feeling the statue man and the vulture gave me, I returned my attention to the church door. I should leave. Shouldn't I? When I didn't follow her, she would get the point and just come back out. Wouldn't she? She was trying to play a stupid game, and I should not indulge her. Right. I should just go home. I didn't, though. I didn't go home. Instead, I followed her into the church. Once inside, I was immediately greeted by a wall of thick, hot air that nearly stole my breath away. It was stale and heavy and took me by surprise. While the air outside had been that of a cool spring night, the air inside was like hell itself. It was a little hard to breathe at first, and I had to pause to adjust. Heavy sweat erupted from my pores. As I paused to gather my bearings, I noticed that I was now standing in a cramped foyer, which opened into a wide but short hallway. Along the hall there were 3 open doorways. I could clearly see them against a yellow light that was brightly spilling from the nearest doorway and into the hall. The yellow light rolled down the short hall and into the foyer, causing me to believe that it was the same light that I had seen tapping against the vibrant colors of the stained glass window. I did not see her, though. I listened closely for her, but all I could hear was my own heart beating against my ribs. Slowly, I began to step through the foyer, before further moving into the hall. I tried to walk quietly, so that I could still listen for any signs of her, but the floorboards below the dingy brown carpet groaned and squeaked beneath my shifting weight. I crept up on the first open doorway, the only door on the right side of the hall. Cautiously, I peeked through. I still did not find her, as I had been hoping. Instead, I looked into what appeared to be a normal, small office space, with the usual desk, chair, bookcase, and metal file cabinet often found in one. The source of the yellow light was a bare, burning bulb that hung from the ceiling. Had someone forgotten to turn the bulb off? Or did they leave it burning on purpose? It didn't matter. I had to keep moving so that I could find her and get the hell out of there, before the person who possibly left the light burning returned to fix their mistake. Continuing along the hall, I arrived at the second of the 3 doors. Beneath the shadows that fell through the open doorway, I could easily make out a simple bathroom, with a single toilet and a single sink. Empty. She was not in there either. Arriving at the last doorway, I once again found a simple room. A kitchen. Aside from its long stove and multiple fridges and freezers, it was also empty. She was not there either. Damn it. The game was getting annoying and I was growing frustrated. I did not want to play hide and seek in some weird church. I was tempted to yell for her to stop hiding, for her to show herself. Rather than filling the church with my booming voice, I chose to continue quietly moving, tiptoeing down the final stretch of hall. The hall eventually opened up into a large room, a sanctuary. Even though the office light had failed to fully reach into the room, I luckily had another light source by which to see. Several, in fact. Tiny orbs of light, to be more accurate, which were being emitted from the tips of white electric candles that were scattered along the room's 4 walls. The tiny dots of light showed me a sanctuary that was more than merely large, but massive. It was a gigantic square room with high ceilings and a hardwood floor. The whole floor had been stained and varnished a glossy red, a contrast to the dingy brown carpet found back in the hall and other rooms. Filling the majority of the new room's space were long wooden pews, which were also a glossy red. It was easy to assume, like most common churches, that the sanctuary was the center of the building, the heart of the church. On the room's far right wall, I could make out a set of double doors that must be the front entrance to the building. Unlike the seemingly cheap back door, the set of front doors appeared to be built thick and sturdy, while also stained and varnished to match the floor and pews. As I scanned the sanctuary further, I couldn't help but to notice that there was a total lack of the usual religious decorations. No hanging crosses, or tortured Messiah, or paintings that depicted paradise or fluttering angels. There wasn't anything like that, at all. which seemed odd and unusual to me. Instead, there were only rows and rows of pews facing toward a slightly raised wooden stage, also stained and varnished like everything else. And at the head of the stage there was only a single wooden podium. My eyes began to dart around the massive room until they eventually stopped on the third row of pews. On her. She was sitting there motionless, her face pointed in the direction of the stage and podium. From my distance in the hallway entrance, I tried to see her mood, to read her expression, but the light of the candles threw shadows across her face, concealing any revelations I might find. Had she even noticed me? Why wasn't she looking my way? Why was she still playing games? After what she did to me, I should be the one playing the games. Not her. Not her. Her head remained unturned as I walked over. There was just enough empty space between herself and the end of the pew for me to sit down at her side. As if she never doubted for a minute that I would chase her into an empty, shadowy church. She never doubted for a second. And she had been simply sitting there waiting for me to catch up. Several seconds of silence passed between us, both of our eyes drawn to the empty stage. Finally, she spoke. "What do you think God is saying to us?" Such a strange question. "I don't hear him," I replied. Then added, "or her." "Well," she continued, before finally turning to look my way. "I hate him. Why would he do this to us?" "God did this," I responded, my voice raising, filling with venom. I turned and found her gaze among the shadows. She didn't answer, but through the shadows, I could vaguely make out some weird energy that was dancing behind her eyes. "No," I continued. "You did this. You're the one who slept with some guy that you just met. Some stranger at your cousin's apartment. You. Not God. You. And you alone. You're the one who tore my heart out and stomped it. For what? I need to know. God doesn't need to talk to me. But you do. Why did you do it? Why? You tore my world apart. Why?" I heard her stifle back what sounded like the beginnings of a sober burst of tears. Without saying another word, she raised and scrambled away, swiftly moving down the row of pews and out the other side. She ran in the opposite direction of the back hallway, while also moving away from the set of front doors. Where the hell was she going? I hadn't noticed the set of stairs until I realized that she was running directly for them. At once, I leapt from my seat. Back on my feet, I dashed for her and these newly discovered steps. But I had no chance of getting to her before she reached them. Down she went. And out of sight. A basement. Perfect. The game continues. As I reached the top of the stairs, I paused to peer down into the dark abyss. None of the small orbs of lights behind me seemed strong enough to pierce the deep black of the basement. Suddenly remembering my cell phone, I pulled it from my pants pocket. After giving the screen several taps, I was able to turn on its flashlight. Using the newly emitted beam of light, I began to descend the stairs, their red-stained boards creaking and groaning. My throat tightened as I moved from one step to the next. It almost felt like plunging into a large body of dark open water, unsure what dangers I might encounter once I broke through the surface. At the bottom of the steps I discovered an area much smaller than I had anticipated. The basement obviously did not run the full extent of the church. Instead, the area below wasn't even half the size of the area above. I threw the phone's beam of light against the nearest corner of the basement, before slowly following along the concrete walls and concrete floors, as I attempted to take in everything the light revealed. The area was sparsely furnished. There were 2 tables. The main table, which appeared to be constructed using several pale folding tables positioned end to end, sat at the center of the basement. It ran quite long and cut the room down the middle. Lining the main table were at least 30 plastic chairs. To the left of the main table were 3 other similar foldable tables, but much shorter, most likely to be used by children. Tucked into the side of the shorter tables were close to a dozen or so plastic chairs, also small in size. How many people went to this church? A couple of feet from there and facing toward the kids' tables, there was what I immediately observed to be a white dry erase board held by a black tripod. Standing directly in front of the white board, almost nose to nose with it, I found her. She was like a statue, standing still and intensely staring at the white board. As my light fell over her, I nearly cried out at her sudden appearance from the dark. Hastily, I marched over. Like before in the sanctuary, she never turned to me or seemed to notice my arrival. It was like she was in a trance or something. The hairs on my arms stood up, and a shiver rushed down my spine. For several seconds I simply stared at the side of her face, which looked ghostly in the phone's bright beam of light. Before I could say a word to her, I noticed that she had a black marker in her hand. 2 lines had been written across the center of the whiteboard. The first line, written in what I knew well to be her handwriting. "God is not here for me more games," I had once told myself. She was being a drama queen. And I have had just about enough of it. But then I saw the second line, also in black, but written in handwriting that I did not recognize. "No, but we are." What the hell? Who else was down here? I didn't get a chance to ask her or better search the basement for another person, because the sound of shuffling feet was unexpectedly heard moving above us. Or at least that's what it seemed like to me. It was faint. But I was almost sure I had heard it. At once, I snuffed out the light. After throwing a blanket of darkness over the both of us, I returned the cell to my pocket. Unconsciously, I held my breath. And then I listened. More faint shuffling. Maybe. Someone walking. Pastor or priest. More than one person. I couldn't be sure. Void of light to guide my way, I somehow found her hand with mine. I squeezed it tight, forcing her to drop the black marker to the concrete floor. We needed to get out of here somehow. We should just make a run for it. Right. But I didn't move. And neither did she. For a minute. 10 minutes. I can't be sure how long we waited and listened for any more signs of movement coming from above us. All I know is that at some point I concluded that the shuffling sounds had either been in my imagination, or whoever had been moving around was gone. Either way, I began to slide toward the bottom of the steps, toward the only source of faint light, pulling her along behind me like a zombie. I paused briefly, listening again. Nothing. After finally releasing my held breath, I began to ascend the stairs toward the room of worship. I tried to tread lightly, to keep the groaning of the wood to a minimum, but every step seemed like an axe splitting a log in two, fully announcing our presence. If one or more people were within earshot of the stairs, it was hard to believe that they would not be aware of us. Yet, we still tiptoed the rest of the way to the top. I didn't want to turn my head until we were all the way at the top and exposed, because I wanted to prolong our fate for as long as I could. Thinking back, I should have never stopped to look. I should have shielded my eyes or closed them altogether. I should have immediately and blindly rushed at the front doors, the closest exit, her hands still gripped in mine. Would I have made it? I can't be sure. But that wouldn't have been the point. Because I would make it either way. But if I would have rushed at the front door as soon as we got to the top of the stairs, I might not have lost her. I didn't, though. I paused. And I looked. I took a stumble back, unbalanced by what I was looking at. The red-stained pews were no longer empty. They were nearly full. Filled with the living and the dead. All of them motionless and staring forward. I looked upon the sides of their many faces. Men and women. Some appeared young. Others seemed older. Some were pink and healthy looking. While others were covered in rotting peeling flesh. And then, scattered among the healthy and rotting faces, were the shadows. They were not tricks of light cast by electric candles. They were something else. As odd as it might seem, somewhere in the back of my mind, I already knew what they were. They were the black remnants of people that were so long dead from the world that their physical vessels had become dust and dirt. The smell. Oh God, that smell. I vomited into my mouth when the stench of death struck me, like a thick cloud of sewage and despair. For whatever reason, I still did not run. Why hadn't I run right then? Instead, I swallowed my puke and followed their gaze, the living and the dead, to the stage, to the podium. Standing at the podium, his single arm stretched out wide, was the statue from atop the pillar. Somehow he had gotten down. His robe was no longer made of concrete, no longer gray, but instead it was a brilliant crimson cloth, like the color of blood as it spouts from a freshly opened wound. I still didn't know if a face existed within the black of his upturned hood, but at that moment there was no doubt that the statue man was looking directly at me. At us. That was when I finally ran. I dashed full speed along the end of the pews and toward the front set of doors. I made it over halfway to the exit before I lost her hand. 1 minute I was still squeezing it tight, and then the next minute there wasn't anything for me to grip. Skidding to an abrupt stop, I looked behind to where she had been a second before. She was gone. As if on instinct, I began to desperately scan the pews, running my eyes back and forth across the mass of bodies still sitting there. All of them had continued to face blankly ahead to the statue man. All of them except one. Her. She was sitting again in the pews, at the end of the same row as before, except instead of peering blankly forward to the crimson man, she was looking to me for help, pain and guilt in her eyes, calling to me without words. I want to say that I went for her. That I rescued her and we made it out safely. But that would be a lie. For the sake of honesty and truth, I ran away and left her there. I didn't even pause to glance back as I escaped the church. I couldn't take seeing her pleading face. Her cheating face. Once I was clear of the church and at the side of Saints Row, I paused only for a second or two. From my position, I could see along the side of the building and across its gravel lot. Where the space had previously been empty, sat cars and other vehicles. Promptly looking away, I pointed myself down the road. I didn't want to see the full lot or what was planted in the field beyond it. I turned my eyes before they could fall upon the tall stone pillar and the emptiness I knew I would find at its peak. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more videos like these, and feel free to suggest specific topics or stories.